On a Tuesday afternoon in Fort Harlan, Texas, a colonel raised his hand to strike a captain in front of 317 soldiers. He never finished the motion. She made sure of that. But this is not a story about what she did. It is a story about why it took that long. Fort Harlan sits 40 miles outside of Abilene, in the kind of West Texas flatland where the horizon never lies. No hills to hide behind, no trees tall enough to give shade worth mentioning. Just sky and heat and the smell of gun oil baked into everything, the concrete, the canvas, the collar of every uniform that has ever been worn on that base. Old-timers who served there in the 80s will tell you the smell never leaves you. They say it the way men talk about things they are not entirely sure they miss. The base had a reputation, not the polished kind printed on recruitment brochures, the earned kind. The kind passed down through assignments and mess hall conversations and the careful way officers speak when they think they might be posted there. Fort Harlan turned out hard men, precise men, men who followed orders the way a blade follows a whetstone with complete submission to the edge being made. It was in every way that mattered Colonel Whitfield Holt's house. He had commanded it for 6 years. 6 years of his voice shaping the culture of that place the way weather shapes sandstone slowly, completely, without asking permission. His boots never saw dirt. His uniform never held a wrinkle past 0600. He was 53 years old with ice in his voice and precision in every movement, and he had built Fort Harlan into something that reflected him so completely that junior officers genuinely could not tell where the base ended and the man began. That was not an accident. What most people at Fort Harlan did not know, what only a handful in the entire chain of command understood, was that Whitfield Holt had been proposed for brigadier general 3 times. 3 separate recommendations, each drafted with careful language about leadership and effectiveness in command presence. 3 times the same name appeared at the bottom of the rejection. General Marcus Webb, Pentagon, no explanation given, no appeal acknowledged. Holt had never spoken of it to anyone at Fort Harlan, not once. But the men who had served under him long enough, men like Staff Sergeant Garrett Briggs, who had 15 years in and noticed the things officers thought nobody noticed, could tell you exactly when those rejection letters arrived. Not by date, by the change in the temperature of rooms, by how Holt's silences grew longer and his patience shorter, and the margin for error he allowed in subordinates went from thin to invisible. There is a kind of man who was good once, genuinely good, who led from the front and earned the loyalty he was given. And then something happened, not one catastrophic thing, but a long accumulation of smaller ones, and the goodness curdled. What was once discipline became control. What was once standards became cruelty. The man himself rarely notices the change. The people beneath him feel it every single day. Garrett Briggs had served under 3 such men across 15 years. The first washed out. The second retired quietly under circumstances nobody officially explained. The third was Whitfield Holt, and Briggs was still waiting to see how that story ended. He did not have to wait much longer. Captain Marin Aldrin arrived at Fort Harlan on a Wednesday morning in late June. The temperature was already 94 degrees at 0800. Heat rose off the tarmac in slow visible waves. She drove herself. No escort. A single duffel bag in the back of a government-issue sedan that had seen better years and worse drivers. She was 32 years old, not tall. She did not carry herself with the deliberate authority that announces itself walking into rooms. What she had instead was something harder to name, a quality of stillness. The way she moved through a space suggested she had already surveyed it before entering. Her eyes were quick without being restless. They cataloged 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq. A Purple Heart she had never once mentioned in a professional context, not because she was ashamed of it, but because she believed a wound survived was a private matter between a soldier and whoever they prayed to. Her proficiency in close quarters combat was instructor level, earned through years of deliberate training that began before she ever put on a uniform and continued through every deployment. She understood with the clarity of someone who had been in enough confined spaces with enough dangerous people that the body is the last line of defense, and it is worth maintaining. Her father had been a Marine drill instructor. Her mother had been a high school English teacher who believed literature and philosophy were not luxuries but survival tools. Marin grew up with Marcus Aurelius before algebra and Hemingway before history class, and a father who demonstrated through the architecture of his daily life that discipline was not punishment, it was the structure that allowed everything else to exist. She had one habit nobody at Fort Harlan knew about yet. In the breast pocket of her uniform, not the left breast where the ribbons were, but the right, she kept a small piece of paper folded into quarters. She had carried it for 3 years. She never opened it in front of anyone. When people noticed the faint rectangular outline against the fabric, she gave them one word if they asked. Reminders. Nobody asked twice. The officer orientation at Fort Harlan was held in a conference room that smelled like industrial cleaning solution and recycled air. 8 officers at a long table, Holt at the head. He did not look up when Marin entered. He was reviewing a document, reading glasses low on his nose. The posture of a man who understood that not acknowledging someone's arrival was itself a statement, a calibration, the first small measurement of how a person responds to being made invisible. Marin sat. She did not clear her throat. She did not arrange her materials with unnecessary noise. She simply waited with the patience of someone who had spent time in considerably worse places waiting for considerably more dangerous things to begin. After 45 seconds, Briggs would later tell her he had timed it, standing outside the door with a clipboard. Holt removed his glasses and looked at her. Soft promotion, he said. The words were quiet, conversational almost, but pitched at exactly the volume that ensured every other officer at the table heard them clearly. Another soft promotion. He said it the way you read a label on a package you already knew would disappoint you. The other officers shifted. Some looked at their papers. One young lieutenant examined his pen with sudden fascination. Marin held Holt's gaze. She did not flinch. She did not respond. She held it one beat longer than comfortable, not threatening, not defiant, just long enough to register that she had heard him, understood him, and filed him accurately. And then she looked back at the briefing materials in front of her. On the way back to her quarters that afternoon, she stopped in a hallway between the administration building and the motor pool. She stood with her back to the wall and placed her right hand flat against the concrete and stayed there for 30 seconds. Not shaking, just still, processing. No one saw it. She made sure of that. But it happened. The words had landed. That was the truth she would not admit to anyone, including herself, for a long time. Soft promotion. 2 words designed to preemptively reduce her to a category before she had done a single thing on that base. For 30 seconds in that hallway, she let herself feel their weight. Then she pushed off the wall, adjusted her cover, and walked to her quarters. That was the first thing Marin Aldrin did at Fort Harlan. Not the briefing, not the formal arrival. 30 seconds in a hallway that nobody ever knew about. It matters because it is the truest thing. 4 days after she arrived, she identified a structural inefficiency in the base's training rotation schedule. It was not dramatic. It was the kind of thing a good officer sees because a good officer looks, and that a careful officer does something about because doing nothing has a cost, even when the cost is invisible. She wrote a memo, 3 pages, specific, sourced, actionable. She submitted it through proper channels at 0700 on a Thursday morning. At 1400, the same day, the memo was reissued to the full officer corps under Holt's letterhead. Her name appeared nowhere in it. The language had been adjusted in small places, words changed, sentence, structure altered, but the analysis was hers. The recommendations were hers. Garrett Briggs found her in the motor pool that evening. He was a large man who held his size carefully, the way physically big people sometimes do when they have learned that taking up space can be misread. He had been at Fort Harlan for 4 years and knew its ground conditions the way a farmer knows soil. He set a copy of the reissued memo on the work surface next to her without a word. She looked at the letterhead, looked back at the maintenance log she had been reading. She wrote the memo again, Briggs said. Not a question. She reached for her pen, turned to a fresh page, started rewriting. He watched her. Why, he said, you know what he'll do with it. She did not look up. Because the soldiers still get the right information. He stood there a few more seconds. Then he picked up the memo copy and walked away. He would think about that answer for the rest of his time at Fort Harlan, the way you think about something that seems simple when you first hear it and grows more complicated the longer you sit with it. She submitted the memo again. Holt reissued it again. She submitted it a 3rd time through a channel he did not monitor. The training rotation changed 6 weeks later, quietly, efficiently, without anyone's name attached to it. The 3rd thing happened in the 2nd week. Marin was crossing the East Quad at 15:30 on a Tuesday when Private Cade Osmond fell into step beside her. He was 19 years old. The uniform still looked borrowed on him, not because it did not fit, but because his body had not yet fully committed to the shape of a soldier. He had the face of someone who had arrived somewhere carrying a question he had not yet figured out how to ask. Ma'am, he said. Aldrin, she said without breaking stride. She had learned early not to stop for casual exchanges on open ground at Fort Harlan. Holt had eyes in places she was still mapping. Yes, ma'am. His voice was careful, considered. There was something underneath it that was more deliberate than nervousness. You ever served with the 3rd Battalion, Kandahar, 2019? She stopped. She turned toward him. Not the quick cataloging look she used in rooms. Something slower. Something that had to work harder. Why, she said. He met her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then he looked straight ahead the way soldiers look when they are not at attention but are making themselves appear to be. Then he walked away. No explanation. No qualifier. Just the question hanging in the air between them like smoke after a fired round. She watched him go. 3rd Battalion, Kandahar, 2019. She had not been there, but she knew people who had. She tried to recall what she knew about that rotation and found that what she knew was not much, and that what she did not know had a shape to it, the shape of information deliberately withheld. She filed it, moved on. She was not built for forgetting. By the end of her 3rd week, the pattern of what Holt was doing had become clear enough to name. It was not rage. Rage would have been easier. Rage makes mistakes. What Holt was doing was more precise than rage. Architecture. He was building conditions around her slowly, methodically, the way you alter the foundation of a building you intend to eventually condemn. And he was doing it through bureaucracy because bureaucracy is the most efficient weapon available to someone who understands how to wield it. Briefings where her contributions were talked over or redirected. Supply allocations that came in partial and late. Training resources promised and quietly reassigned. Communications arriving after relevant windows had closed. None of it individually damning, and all of it collectively a campaign. She had seen this kind of warfare before. Not in Afghanistan or Iraq there, it was simpler, the threat declared, but in other postings, in other rooms in the atmosphere of commands, where power has calcified around a single person for too long, and that person has begun to mistake the command for a possession. In places like Fort Harlan, she reminded herself, you do not fight early. You fight right. Briggs knocked on her office door that Friday evening, 2 beats, which meant what he had to say was not for the hallway. She waved him in. He sat across from her and placed his forearms on his knees. 15 years, she said, still reading the report in front of her. 4 years here at Harlan. Fort Campbell before that. Fort Bliss before that. Yes, ma'am. She looked up. Tell me what I don't know. He considered where to begin. He's done this before, Briggs said. 3 captains in 4 years. Built conditions around them through channels. Made it look like attrition. 2 requested transfers. 1 put in his papers. She nodded. Did any of them push back? Not the way you're thinking about it. She looked at him steadily. How do you know how I'm thinking about it? He almost smiled. Because you rewrote that memo twice, ma'am. She leaned back. What else? His voice dropped. He's not just poking anymore. He's winding up. The supply delays, the briefing interference, the tempo has increased over the past 10 days. Something changed. She considered this. What happened to the 3 captains? One is at Fort Stewart, doing well keeping his head down. The other, Briggs paused, left the army. She absorbed this without visible reaction. Then let's be ready when he swings, she said. Briggs rose, moved toward the door. Garrett, she said. He stopped. The anonymous note. Slid under my office door last week. He's losing face, be ready. Have you seen that handwriting anywhere else on this base? The pause that followed was not long, but it was deliberate, the pause of someone who has already made a decision and is simply confirming the moment to share it has arrived. Yes, ma'am, Briggs said. Holt's daily operational memos. The handwriting is his. She went very still. He stepped out and pulled the door closed behind him. She sat alone for a long time. The air conditioning made the only sound. Outside across the quad, she could hear the distant cadence of evening formation. She reached into her breast pocket and held the folded paper without opening it. Pressed it flat between her palms, the way you press a compass to still it. He wrote the note himself. He was not communicating through escalation. He was trying to manufacture a state of mind vigilance, curdled into paranoia, awareness sharpened into anxiety. He wanted her thinking about the swing before it came so that when it came, she would react instead of respond. The note was not intelligence, it was interference. He was reaching into her psychology from a distance and trying to reset the frequency of her attention. She put the paper back, looked at the wall. There was a photograph in the hallway outside Holt's office. She had noticed it her second day. A unit photograph, Afghanistan, the timestamp reading 2004. Holt was young in it, thinner. Smiling, not the performed smile of a man managing his image, but something produced by genuine joy in the company of people he trusted. His hand was on the shoulder of the man beside him. The men around him were laughing at something outside the frame. Whatever he had been in that photograph, he was not anymore. A knock came at her door. 3 sharp beats. Briggs's knock, but he had already left. She looked up. "Come in." He opened the door again. His face had changed. The professional blankness had been replaced by something more immediate. "Ma'am," his voice was quieter now. "You need to see your personnel file." She waited. "The transfer request," he said. "The one logged before you arrived." I pulled the submission timestamp. She held his gaze. "It was filed 3 days before your orders were cut for Fort Harlan," he said. 3 days before anyone outside a very small circle knew you were being posted here. Whoever filed it knew about your assignment before you did." The room was quiet. "What name was on the submission?" she said. Briggs set a single sheet on her desk. She read the name. She did not recognize it, not from Fort Harlan, not from any posting she had held, not from any document she had reviewed since arriving. A name that belonged to no one she had encountered. "Who is this?" she said. He met her eyes. "That is what I'm still working out, ma'am." She folded the paper carefully along its creases and set it on the corner of her desk. Straightened it until its edges ran parallel with the desk's edge. "Find me that name," she said. "Yes, ma'am." He left. She turned to the window. Outside, evening was coming in over the flat Texas land, the way it comes in out there, not by degrees, but all at once, like a decision finally made. The sky moved from white to gold to a deep amber that made the whole base look for a few minutes like somewhere men had once done things that history had not finished judging. Fort Harlan. Whitfield Holt's house. 3 days before her orders were cut, before she existed to any of them. She thought about Private Kate Osmond and the question asked on the East Quad in a tone that had no business being used for casual conversation. She thought about the photograph of Holt in 2004, young and laughing. She thought this place has a history and that history has not finished happening. Then she turned from the window and got back to work. The order came down on a Monday at 05:45. No advance notice, no scheduling, coordination, no memo through proper channels. Just a runner from the command office with a printed slip that landed on Garrett Briggs's desk before sunrise, informing him that his unit was to report to the Eastern Training Ground in full combat load at 0700 for an endurance assessment. His unit, specifically his unit, not the rotation already scheduled for the week, not any of the 3 other companies on the training calendar, just the one commanded by Captain Marin Aldrin. Briggs read the slip twice, folded it with the deliberateness of a man preserving evidence. Then he went to find his captain. She was already in her office. She had been there since 0500, which was not unusual. She read the slip without changing expression and handed it back. "Make sure everyone eats before they gear up," she said. That was all she said about it. The Eastern Training Ground at Fort Harlan was a wide, flat stretch of packed earth and gravel that absorbed heat the way asphalt absorbs it in a parking lot thoroughly without mercy, radiating it back at the human body from below as well as above. By 0700, the temperature was already 91 degrees. By 0830, when the assessment was deep into its second hour, it had crossed 103. 41 soldiers, full combat load, Kevlar plate carrier rifle pack. The weight ranging between 55 and 70 pounds per soldier depending on assignment. The circuit, a 2-mile run and obstacle crossing, a weighted carry over a quarter-mile of uneven ground, a react-to-contact drill at the far end, then the return run. Holt stood on the observation tower above the western end of the ground. He had a clipboard and a radio and 2 junior officers flanking him who were very carefully not making eye contact with each other. At the starting line, Marin stood with her unit. She had not positioned herself behind them or beside them. She had taken her place in the formation. Same load as her soldiers, same weight, same heat. Private Kate Osmond was 3 positions to her left, his expression carefully neutral in the way of someone working hard not to look at the observation tower. He looked at her instead. "You don't have to run with us, ma'am," he said quietly. She turned toward him just slightly. "If they want to see me break," she said, "they'll have to watch me run first." He held her eyes for 1 second. Then he reset his gaze forward, adjusted his grip on his rifle, and waited for the whistle. It went. They ran. There is a quality to watching people perform under conditions designed to break them that has nothing to do with outcome and everything to do with what is revealed. The heat pressed down on that ground with measurable weight. The gravel shifted underfoot in ways that cost energy on every stride. The weighted carry reached into the body's reserves and took from the part being held back for later. Marin ran in the middle of her formation, not leading from the front, which would have been theater. Not at the back, which would have been protected. In the middle, where she could observe everyone and the struggling ones could find her without searching. When a young specialist named Darrow began falling behind in the second mile, she did not call attention to it. She shifted back 2 positions, matched his pace without comment, and stayed there until his breathing evened and his stride lengthened, and he pulled himself back into the formation on his own terms. Then she returned to the middle. Nobody was left behind. When the last soldier crossed the finish line and the unit's aggregate time was recorded first place by 4 minutes and 11 seconds over the previous week's best performance, by any unit on that ground, Briggs looked up at the observation tower. Holt set his clipboard down on the railing with a controlled precision that communicated to anyone watching carefully that the precision was the only thing preventing something else. Then he walked off the tower without looking at the ground below. Kate Osmond stood at the finish line with his hands on his knees, breathing the way you breathe when you have given genuinely everything. He looked up at the empty tower railing. Then at Marin, who was standing straight, not performing ease. She did not feel but straight, present still there. He looked at his own hands and nodded once to himself at something that had no words yet. That evening, a second note appeared under Marin's office door. She recognized the handwriting before she finished unfolding it. "He's out of moves. Watch the ones you can't see." She read it, placed it beside the first on her desk. 2 notes, same author, performing 2 different phases of the same psychological strategy. The first had been designed to produce anxiety. This one was designed to manufacture a false sense of progress, to suggest she was winning, to soften her alertness at the moment he was redirecting his efforts somewhere she had not yet looked. Cornered power does not become less dangerous. It becomes more specific. It narrows. It finds the angle that is hardest to defend. She locked both notes in her desk drawer and sat down to think about angles. 3 days later, Major Stellan Thorne knocked on her office door at 1900. She knew who it was. Briggs had told her Thorne had been looking for a private moment with her for 48 hours. She knew Thorne by observation, the major who occupied the middle of every room, who voted with silence in every briefing, who had been at Fort Harlan for 14 months and produced nothing controversial, nothing remarkable. By the assessment of everyone who thought about him at all, he was furniture. She had not thought he was furniture since the second week. She had noticed how he positioned himself in briefings relative to the exits. She had noticed his silence had a listening quality rather than an absent one. She had noticed his eyes moved in the pattern of someone recording, not just observing. "Come in." He entered, closed his door, and stood in the middle of the room with the manner of someone who has rehearsed a conversation and has now set the rehearsal aside in favor of plain speech. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to understand that I'm telling you because the situation has moved faster than anticipated, and you are standing in the center of something whose shape you deserve to know." She watched him without speaking. He placed a folded document on her desk. He did not explain it. He let her open it. She read it twice. It was an authorization memo. Inspector General, Department of the Army, dated 8 months prior, authorizing a covert administrative inquiry into the command practices of Colonel Whitfield, Holt, Fort Harlan, Texas. The authorizing signature at the bottom was not a Fort Harlan name. It was General Marcus Webb. Pentagon. 8 months, she said. 8 months, he confirmed. Documentation of communication irregularities. Supply record manipulation. Personnel file anomalies and statements from soldiers who requested reassignment under circumstances that do not match their official paperwork. There are 14 documented instances classifiable as command abuse. She set the document down. "You were here before I arrived." "By 6 months, yes." She held his gaze. "Why are you telling me now?" "Because the tempo changed when you arrived," he said. "Before you, his conduct was systematic and controlled, the kind genuinely difficult to see unless you were specifically looking. Since your arrival, the pace has accelerated. The discipline is slipping." He paused. "In my assessment, he is going to do something that cannot be undone. Soon." And Webb Thorne met her eyes. General Webb is the officer who has been blocking Holt's promotions. 3 separate occasions. He has had awareness of Holt's conduct since 2021. The obstacle has been documentation. Soldiers who experienced it either did not come forward formally or were transferred before their accounts could be properly recorded. He was waiting for a situation that generates its own record. She absorbed this slowly. "He knew I was coming," she said. Thorne said nothing, which was its own answer. She thought about the transfer request filed 3 days before her orders were cut, the unrecognized name. She thought about Webb's signature on the document in front of her. She thought about the shape of a long game, the kind played by people who understand that the right conditions must be constructed, not merely waited for. She thought about whether she was a person in this story or a piece on a board. Then she decided that distinction changed nothing about what she was going to do. "Who knows you're here tonight," she said. "Nobody. Keep it that way." She held the document out to him. He took it, moved toward the door. "Stellan," she said. He stopped. "The name on the transfer request, the one filed before I arrived. Do you know it?" He turned back. "A warrant officer. He has since been transferred. He was in Holt's personal staff rotation. He did what he was told." She nodded. That part of the story, then, was simpler than it had looked. Holt had learned of her posting through the informal channels that exist in every institution, and that certain commanders learn to operate the way other people learn to drive. He had used a subordinate to try to preempt her arrival, and the subordinate had complied because compliance had become the cost of survival. She understood that too. "Thank you," she said. Thorne left. 2 nights before the live fire exercise, Briggs came to the motor pool at 1930 with the manner of a man who has been deciding whether to speak for approximately 12 hours. Marin was at the work surface with an equipment log. She looked up. He sat on the equipment case and clasped his hands. "You asked about Kandahar," he said. "3rd Battalion 2019. She set the log down. "I was at Bagram that year," he said. "Not in the field, but I knew people who were, and I heard things I was told very clearly were not things I had heard." She waited. Holt was a lieutenant colonel then, commanding a joint operation in Kandahar province, complex terrain, multiple moving elements. The mission was going sideways at the 18-hour mark. He had a choice: consolidate the primary objective or hold position and wait for a 4-man patrol that had been cut off in a secondary engagement. He stopped. "He chose the objective," Marin said. "He chose the objective," Briggs confirmed. He ordered the primary force to withdraw and complete the mission. The 4-man patrol was in contested ground without support. By the time anything was documented officially, the language had been changed. The patrol was described as having moved to their position on independent initiative. The withdrawal was described as consistent with operational parameters. She looked at him. One of them didn't come back. One of them did not come back. Neither spoke for a moment. In the motor pool, the fluorescent lights hummed. Outside, the base moved through its nighttime rhythms. "The inquiry," she said. "There wasn't one. Not formally. There was an internal review that lasted 3 weeks and concluded with language about operational complexity and difficult field decisions." 6 months after that conclusion, Holt was promoted to colonel and given command of Fort Harlan. She absorbed this fully, not just the facts, brutal as they were, but the machinery behind them. The thing that had transformed the photograph of a laughing young officer in 2004 into the man across the table who calibrated contempt to the decibel of deniability. It was not ambition alone. It was guilt that had been officially absolved without being internally resolved. A man who had done something unforgivable and been told by every surrounding system that it was in fact forgivable, who had been promoted for it, who had learned in the most concrete way available that the system did not punish the choice he made. It rewarded it, and something in that absolution had made him worse. Because if the system says you did nothing wrong and you know you did something wrong, and you cannot reconcile those two things, what grows in the space between them is not remorse. It is contempt. Contempt for the system that absolved him. Contempt for the people who trusted it. Contempt most of all for anyone whose existence demonstrated that the choice he made was not the only one available. "Who was the 4th man," she said. "The one who didn't come back." Briggs looked at his hands. "A staff sergeant, 2 prior tours, good soldier by every account I ever heard. He had a son. The boy was about 15 when it happened." She thought about Cade Osman at the starting line in his borrowed uniform. The question asked on the East Quad in a tone that had no business there. "Ma'am, you ever served with the 3rd Battalion Kandahar 2019? She thought about the 1 second of eye contact before he walked away. She said he joined to find out what happened to his father. Briggs looked at her. His expression was that of a man who has just watched someone arrive at the same destination he reached and arrive there faster. "That's my read," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she told him to keep Cade close. Not surveillance. Close. He nodded, started to rise. "One more thing, Garrett." He settled back. "Before Kandahar. Before any of what he's become. The photograph in his hallway, 2004 Afghanistan. He was different then. Genuinely different." Briggs was quiet. What started the rot before Kandahar gave it permission to finish? He thought about it honestly. I don't think there was one thing he said. I think it was slow. Years of watching people with less ability get promoted faster because they were better at managing upward. Years of doing the actual work of command and watching it get attributed to the chain above him. He got tired of doing right and watching wrong win. And then in 2019, he had a moment where he could choose right or choose to protect his record. And he chose his record, and the world told him that was fine. And once the system tells you it's fine, he paused. You have to believe the system, because the alternative is living with what you actually are. She sat with this. That doesn't excuse it, she said. No, ma'am, he said immediately. It doesn't. But it explains it. Yes, ma'am, it does. She nodded once, dismissed him with a look. He left. That night, the night before the live fire exercise, Marin sat in her office with the desk lamp low and Thorne's document on the desk in front of her. The lieutenant's name in government font. A human story reduced to administrative language the way the institution had been reducing human stories for as long as the institution had existed. She reached into her breast pocket and took out the folded paper. She had not opened it in 3 years. She had carried it every day through the end of her Iraq rotation, through every posting that followed through 43 days at Fort Harlan, and she had pressed it flat between her palms on hard days and held it closed in her fist on harder ones. She had not needed to open it. The names were memorized. She did not need to read them. She needed to carry them, which is a different thing entirely. She unfolded it now. 4 names, her own handwriting, written in pen on a night 3 years ago when she had needed to make a record that no official document would make for her. Not a memorial, a ledger, a private accounting of what the job had cost, recorded by the person who had been close enough to watch the cost be extracted. She read each name slowly. Then she looked at the blank space below the 4th. Blank space in a ledger of this kind is never empty. It is potential. It is the room the next name will occupy when the time comes and the cost is paid again. She picked up a pencil. She wrote Kate Osmond. She did it without a conscious decision. The understanding had been building for days since the motor pool conversations, since the East Quad, since she calculated what it meant for a 19-year-old to arrive at Fort Harlan carrying what he was carrying and to find himself inside the machinery of the exact system he had come to reckon with. She was not predicting loss. She was acknowledging risk. She was doing for him what she did for everyone in her care, counting the cost before it arrived, because that was the only way she knew how to fight for the margin. She folded the paper, put it back. Then she sat with her hands flat on the desk and thought about the lieutenant whose file was open in front of her and the 3 captains who had been worked through this base and the 19-year-old in a borrowed uniform who had followed his father's ghost to West Texas and was now standing in the path of several things converging at once. A knock. 3 beats. Come in, she said. Briggs opened the door. He read the room without appearing to. Then he simply said, "You're still here." "Still here," she said. He nodded, pulled the door closed without another word. She turned off the lamp and sat in the dark listening to Fort Harlan settle into its nighttime routines. Tomorrow would be the live fire exercise. 317 soldiers on a training ground. Holt at his command station. She was not afraid of what was coming. She was ready for it in the way you can only be ready for something when you have already named the cost and decided with full knowledge of what you are deciding that you will pay it. 4 days before the exercise, Thorne had returned with a second document, thinner than the first, a personnel file abstract with a classification stamp and a date 3 years prior. He placed it on her desk and stood back. Voluntary reassignment, he said. That is how it is coded in the official record. Personal and family reasons. She looked at the document. What actually happened? His jaw set slightly. There is a witness statement in the IG file, given anonymously by someone in an adjacent office. Holt struck her. During a private meeting, an open palm strike. The room was quiet. He covered it in 48 hours. Thorne continued. Her reassignment was filed, processed, and completed within 2 days. She was gone before the end of the week. The witness did not come forward officially. They were afraid of what it would cost. She read the name in the abstract, said nothing for a long moment. She was not the first. No, ma'am. She looked at the classification stamp. Someone created this file, she said, sealed but preserved, which means someone made a decision to build a parallel record through channels outside Holt's reach. Thorne met her eyes. Webb's office established a secondary tracking system in 2022, after the second block promotion. At that point, the decision was made to begin building a permanent record that could withstand the institutional pressure that would eventually be applied to erase it. She processed this. The architecture of what Webb had been constructing was now fully visible to her. The patience of it, years of careful accumulation, slow construction of something that could survive the force that would be brought to bear against it, was the only strategy that had any chance of working against someone as deeply embedded as Holt. But it required someone to be standing at the center when it finally broke open. Someone who would not be moved. Was I anticipated, she said. Thorne looked at her carefully. I don't know the full scope of what General Webb planned for, he said. I know my task and I have done it. What I can tell you is that your arrival changed the timeline significantly. Whether that was calculated or whether it was, he paused, fortunate circumstance, I genuinely cannot say. She nodded. The lieutenant, she said before he reached the door. Whatever this produces, whatever the inquiry concludes. She is owed more than a corrected personnel record. Thorne stopped, turned. Something in his expression acknowledged the weight of what she had said without being able to do anything about it in that moment. I know, he said. He left. The live fire exercise was scheduled for Thursday. Standard combined arms maneuver, infantry movement, fire suppression, objective seizure. 317 soldiers across multiple units organized into a deployment pattern covering approximately 400 meters of training ground. Holt positioned himself at the field command station on the north side before the first soldier took the field. He had a radio and a vehicle and 2 aides in the manner of a man who had decided something was going to happen today and was prepared to author it. Marin took her position with her unit on the left flank of the primary formation. She had reviewed the operational plan the previous evening. She identified 3 suboptimal elements in the plan and one that created actual tactical risk. The left flank deployment left a gap in suppression coverage over approximately 80 meters of the western approach to the primary objective. Not catastrophic in a training context, but the kind of gap that in a real engagement would be found and used, and the point of a training exercise was to find those things first. She was not looking for a confrontation. She was doing her job. The exercise began at 1300. At the 14-minute mark, she identified the gap. She assessed it for 30 seconds. Then she issued a field reposition order to the 2 squads on her left, 14 meters, to close the coverage gap. Tactically sound, within her authority as company commander. Consistent with the operational doctrines Fort Harlan taught and that Holt himself had covered in a command lecture the previous month. She called it into the exercise command net as required. Across the ground in his vehicle at the command station, Holt heard the transmission. He was out of the vehicle before the call finished. She heard him before she saw him. His voice crossed the exercise ground with a pitch that cut through ambient noise the way a crack of wood cuts through forest sound, sudden, specific, impossible to misread. Captain Aldrin. She turned. He was crossing toward her with the stride of a man who had made a decision. No aides. He had come alone, which meant he had come without the buffer of witnesses on his side. He did not appear to register this as significant. The soldiers within line of sight were aware. Awareness moves through a military formation the way current moves through water, silently faster than it should be possible. Who authorized you to reposition that formation, Captain? She faced him fully. Her voice was even. The reposition is within my command authority, sir. I identified a coverage gap in the western approach and moved to address it per field initiative protocol. The doctrine is in the October training manual. You covered it yourself at the November command lecture. He kept walking. He did not stop at the regulation distance. He came closer. Close enough that she could see the expression on his face, not the cold precision of briefings, not the calibrated contempt of the orientation room. Something rawer than that. Something that had been accumulating for a long time under the precision and the calibration and had found in this moment a gap of its own. You do not adjust my formations. His voice had dropped. That drop was worse than the volume had been. You do not override my operational plan in the field in front of my command. Sir, she said, I followed protocol. He stepped into her space, close enough to make the spatial violation unambiguous to every soldier watching. His voice went low. Private, almost the irony of privacy in front of 300 people apparently lost on him. You want to embarrass me, he said. You came here to embarrass me. Sir, she said, these are your soldiers. I am executing your doctrine. For one moment, nothing moved. Even the exercise seemed to thin at the edges, the radio traffic quieter, the commands farther away, as if the air itself had turned to attend to what was happening at the center. She did not step back. She did not shift her weight. She held the ground she was standing on with the stillness of someone who has decided this piece of earth is where she will stand until there is a reason to stand somewhere else. Then his hand came up. Not fast, not slow, deliberate. The way you raise a hand when you want what it means to be understood before it arrives. A controlled motion in a situation where the control was finally failing, expressed in the one language he had been deferring to for weeks. She watched it rise. She let it rise to the point where 317 soldiers had seen it. where there was no version of what this was that could be rewritten later into operational complexity or professional disagreement or difficult field conditions, where the record being made was complete and unambiguous and permanent. Then her left hand moved. Not decided. Reflexed. Years of training stored in the body in a different location than the mind accessed below the threshold of deliberate thought. Her hand took his wrist mid-motion with a grip that had leverage built into its geometry. Pivot. Step through. His weight went forward because physics required it. And then the sound. Sharp. Specific. It traveled across the exercise ground in the way that only that sound travels immediately, completely into a silence that had been waiting for exactly it. Holt went to one knee. His face was white, his mouth open, his right arm bent at an angle it was not meant to hold, and he was looking at it with the expression of a man who has received information about reality he was not prepared for. She released him immediately. Stepped back one step the distance required to be clear of him without creating the appearance of retreat. She looked down at him. Her voice was quiet, the quietness of something fully decided. "You will never raise your hand to me again, Colonel." The exercise ground was silent. 317 soldiers stood in the wait of that moment, not because of the sound, because of what came before it. The hand going up, the captain standing still. The choice she made to let it rise past the point where any rewriting was possible. A medic was already running from the eastern edge of the ground. On the perimeter, Major Stellan Thorne took out his phone. A message already composed. 3 sentences addressed to Colonel Felix Warren at the Pentagon Inspector General Liaison Office. It happened. Footage is clean. 3 angles. He sent it. Put his phone away. Watched the medic reach Holt and the formation hold, and Marinee Aldrin standing at its center the way something stands when it was built for exactly the conditions it is standing in. She turned to face her soldiers. "Formation remains intact," she said. 4 words. Not a question, not a request. The voice of someone who has earned the right to speak them. The formation held. The medic splinted Holt's arm with the efficiency of someone trained for exactly this injury, and the careful neutrality of someone who understood that everything surrounding this particular injury was well above his pay grade. He called for transport. He did not make eye contact with anyone he did not have to. Holt did not speak during the splinting. He sat on the ground with his back straight, the last piece of authority available to him, and looked at nothing specific. The shock was passing, and what replaced it behind his eyes was harder to read. Not rage, something more interior. The expression of a man recalculating. The transport vehicle came from the Western Road. He was driven to the base medical facility without ceremony. Marin stood until the last of the 317 had cleared the field. Then she looked down. The piece of paper from her breast pocket lay on the ground. It had fallen during the movement. It lay face down as the packed dirt of the exercise ground, slightly darkened at one corner, where the Texas dust had already begun to claim it. She looked at it for a moment. Then she picked it up, smoothed it against her palm, and placed it back in her pocket. She walked off the field alone. Colonel Felix Warren arrived at Fort Harlan at 0600 the following morning in a vehicle with Pentagon plates and the bearing of a man who had been on a plane since before midnight and did not consider this remarkable. He was 50 years old with close-cropped gray hair and a face that had made a permanent arrangement with impassivity. He had reviewed 3 versions of the footage during the flight. He had read Thorne's documentation. He had spoken with General Marcus Webb at 2200 the previous evening, a conversation that lasted 9 minutes and ended with Webb saying one sentence that Warren wrote down and did not need to consult again. Get the record right. The conference room Warren requisitioned was in the administrative wing. Fluorescent light, steel table, designed to make comfort impossible and difficult conversations containable. He set up the footage drone camera helmet cam from a sergeant in the 2nd Squad surveillance tower and waited. Marin came in at 0615 in a clean uniform that showed no evidence of the previous day except for something around the eyes that existed in the territory between fatigue and grief without being either. She sat without being asked, placed her hands flat on the table. He looked at her for a moment, then picked up his pen. "Colonel Holt's radius is fractured," he said. "Clean break mid-shaft. He will require surgery. His legal representation has filed a preliminary statement describing the incident as an unprovoked physical assault by a subordinate officer in the presence of battalion-level personnel." She held his gaze. "He raised his hand to strike me, sir." "The footage confirms the motion." Warren nodded. "The footage confirms the motion." He paused. "It also confirms that you applied a joint manipulation technique consistent with close quarters defensive training. The force used was sufficient to produce the fracture. Those are the facts as the record shows them. Those are the facts, she said. He set down his pen, picked it up again. Why didn't you step back, he said. When he came toward you, standard de-escalation involves creating distance. She did not hesitate. I did de-escalate, sir. I held my position and my response until the threat was unambiguous. I did not raise my voice. I did not raise my hands. I restated protocol twice. When he initiated physical contact, I responded with minimum force sufficient to stop the motion. I released him immediately. Warren was quiet. That is a precise answer. It is an accurate one. He held her gaze. You let his hand rise. Yes, sir. Why? Because 317 soldiers were watching, she said. And because there have been others before me who could not prove what happened to them in rooms with no witnesses. I made sure there were witnesses. The room was quiet for a long time. He reached to his right and set a stack of printed pages on the table between them. He did not read from them. Since last night, he said, I have received 43 unsolicited written statements from Fort Harlan personnel of various ranks, by email, by formal memorandum, and in 3 cases by handwritten letter delivered to this office before 0600 this morning. She looked at the stack. They are consistent in their characterization of the command climate under Colonel Holt. They are also consistent in their characterization of yesterday's incident. He met her eyes. The word that appears most frequently across statements from people who could not have coordinated their language is restraint. Several use the phrase minimum necessary force, which is, as you know, the precise doctrinal standard for defensive response. She said nothing. He slid a single sheet across the table. Temporary administrative suspension pending completion of the inquiry. Procedural requirement when force has been applied against a superior officer regardless of circumstance. He paused. You will remain on base. Full access to your quarters and office. No restrictions on movement or communication. She picked up the sheet. Read it. Set it down. How long? That depends on factors I am not fully in a position to discuss with you this morning. She nodded. Then the lieutenant, 3 years ago, the one whose reassignment was coded as voluntary. Warren's expression did not change, but something behind it adjusted. She is owed something more than a corrected personnel record, Marin said. Whatever this produces, whatever the inquiry concludes, she is owed more than that. Warren stood at the table for a moment with the stillness of someone who has been carrying a specific weight and has just been addressed about it directly. I know, he said. Then he gathered his materials and left. Outside the administrative wing, the base had the texture of a place where something significant has occurred, and the institutional machinery is working to restore the appearance of normalcy while understanding that the appearance is all it can restore. Morning formation had happened on schedule. Meals were being served on schedule. Vehicles were moving on their usual roads. But the conversations had changed. The silences had changed. The way people looked at each other in corridors had changed in the way that looks change when people share knowledge of something not yet officially acknowledged. Marin walked to the motor pool by the long route past the East Quad. She was aware of the attention. She did not perform unawareness of it. She walked with the quality she had always carried, present, deliberate. At the edge of the quad, 3 privates stood under the barracks overhang, not doing anything in particular, simply waiting for something to clarify. When she passed one of them, a soldier she had never spoken to, seen only in the background of formations, straightened. Not to attention, something less formal and more genuine than attention. She acknowledged him with a nod that contained everything she had available to give in that moment. It was not nothing. Briggs found her in the motor pool at 1100. He sat on the equipment case and looked at her for a moment. They're taking you off the line, he said. Temporarily. Until the inquiry. He looked at the floor, then back at her. How are you? She set down the form she was holding. That is the most open-ended question I have been asked since I arrived here. He almost smiled. I'm all right, she said. Approximately. He nodded. Then what I saw out there yesterday? I've served under 8 commanding officers over 15 years. I've watched a lot of things happen on a lot of training grounds. He met her eyes. I have never seen anyone do what you did. Not the technique. Anyone with your training could have done the technique. He paused. I mean the waiting. The decision to let it become undeniable. Most people who had been through what you'd been through those 6 weeks would have moved sooner. Nobody would have blamed them. She was quiet. I thought about the lieutenant, she said. The one from 3 years ago. The one who had no witnesses. He absorbed this. Then he said quietly, don't minimize what it cost you to stand there. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she reached into her breast pocket, took out the folded paper and set it on the work surface between them. He looked at it, did not reach for it. There are 4 names in there, she said. People I served with. People I watched go home in ways they did not plan to. I have carried that list for 3 years because I needed to remember what the job actually costs. Not the doctrine, the costs. She paused. 2 nights ago, I almost added a 5th name before the cost was paid. He was very still. I wrote Kate Osmond's name in there, she said, in pencil, because I knew what he was carrying, and I knew what this place would do to him if it closed around him the way it has closed around everyone else. She looked at him. I could not add another name to that list because I ran out of time. Briggs looked at the paper on the work surface. You didn't, he said. That's the point. You didn't. Holt's discharge was not announced publicly. There was no press release, no official statement from the Fort Harlan Public Affairs Office. There was simply on the 4th day after the incident, the observable fact that Holt was no longer present. His vehicle gone from its space. His name absent from the duty roster. The plaque outside the commandant's office door removed with the care of someone who understood that the manner of removal was itself a message. The official record would eventually show that Colonel Whitfield Holt had been administratively separated under a negotiated agreement. The Inspector General's report containing Thorne's 8 months of documentation, the 43 statements, the footage from 3 angles, the parallel file Webb's office had maintained since 2021, and the sealed account of the lieutenant from 3 years prior, was classified at a level that placed it beyond routine access. No formal charges were filed. This sat in Marin's chest with the weight of an incomplete thing. She understood the calculus. She understood the classification protected the soldiers whose statements had been taken, shielded the mechanisms that had finally worked from scrutiny that might compromise their future use, and created the conditions under which the negotiated outcome had been possible. She understood all of this with the part of her that had spent a career learning how systems function as opposed to how they are described. The part of her that had kept a list of names for 3 years understood it differently. Brigadier General Aldous Blake arrived on the 7th day, 56 years old, with the bearing of a man sent to manage things that had grown larger than their container. He met with Webb's representative with the legal counsel, and then he met with Marin. He stood at the window of the commandant's office, a commandant's office without a commandant, and looked at the West Texas flat before turning. Captain Aldrin, you have made quite a name for yourself. I didn't ask to, sir. He assessed her. Journalists are calling. A senator from this state has requested a briefing from the Army Inspector General. Veterans organizations are mobilizing. He paused. You have become, whether you intended it or not, the face of something considerably larger than a company commander at a base in West Texas. I am a company commander at a base in West Texas, sir. That is the entirety of what I came here to be. He moved to the desk and held out a folder. She took it. Read it. Westfield Command, Virginia. Effective in 30 days. Officially described as a lateral promotion with expanded responsibilities. She set it on the desk. Sir, she said, with respect, you are not silencing me. You are amplifying me. He looked at her for a moment. Then something in his expression shifted not to warmth, but to a directness that was its own form of respect. I know, he said. He said it without deflection. I know exactly what this does and what it does not do. Silencing you is not the goal, Captain. If it were, the last 7 days would have gone differently. She waited. Westfield has a problem, he said. Different history, different people, same root system. The person I send there needs to have demonstrated that they will not. He paused, choosing the word accommodate that root system. She held his gaze. Thought about the 43 people who had written their names before 6 in the morning. About the soldiers who had stood in 2 rows along a road because they wanted to, not because they were ordered to. About everything the last 43 days had cost and produced. She picked up the orders. I'll report as directed, sir, she said. Blake nodded, dismissed her with a look. She walked out of the commandant's office into the hallway and did not look back at the plaque-shaped absence on the door. She was in her quarters at 2200 when her phone rang. Pentagon Exchange, a number she did not recognize. She answered. Captain Aldrin. The voice was measured and unhurried. The voice of a man who had been in enough difficult conversations to understand that how you begin one determines whether the person on the other end stays with you. My name is Marcus Webb. I am calling you directly because there are things you deserve to hear from the person responsible for them, and because the kind of document this conversation would produce in writing is not one I am prepared to create tonight. She sat on the edge of her cot. General Webb, I have been aware of Whitfield Holt's conduct since 2021, he said. I am the officer who blocked his promotion 3 times. I want you to understand the full shape of that decision because it was not clean, and I have carried it on many nights since the first time I made it. She waited. Blocking the promotion communicated to Holt that someone above him knew without telling him who or what they knew. That knowledge did not improve his behavior. It narrowed it. He became more controlled, more precise, and more dangerous in the way people become dangerous when they understand they are being watched but cannot identify the watcher. I had calculated that consequence and accepted it as preferable to the alternative, which was placing him somewhere with more authority and less exposure. He paused. I have not always been certain I was right. I believe I was. I am not entirely certain. The candor was unexpected. She recognized it as genuine, not a performance of accountability, but the directness of a man who has been carrying the weight of a decision long enough to stop managing how it appears. The transfer request, she said. The name I didn't recognize. A warrant officer on Holt's personal staff web said, acting on instruction, he learned of your assignment through an informal personnel contact, a favor owed through the channels that exist in every institution, and that certain commanders learned to use the way other people use a telephone. The warrant officer complied because compliance had become the cost of his survival inside that command. He is not the center of this. Holt is the center of this, she said. Holt has always been the center of this, Webb said. The machinery around him, the informal contacts, the subordinates who executed his instructions, the institutional language that transformed Kandahar into operational complexity, that machinery did not create him. It served him. And it served him for long enough that he came to believe it would serve him indefinitely. She sat with this. The unrecognized name on the transfer request, the piece that had sat unresolved since her first week, was not a separate thread. It was the same man, the same reach, the same machinery operating forward in time to prevent something that was going to happen anyway. Because what was going to happen did not depend on any specific person. It depended on someone arriving who would not be processed by the system the way the system expected people to be processed. Westfield, she said. Webb was quiet for a moment. Westfield has a different history and a different cast of people, he said. The route is familiar. He paused. The person I send there needs to have demonstrated something I cannot train for and cannot mandate. He let the sentence stand without completing it. It did not need completion. She looked at the wall of her quarters, the bare institutional surface that had never become familiar in 43 days. The lieutenant, she said. 3 years ago. Her record has been amended, Webb said. She has been contacted. What she chooses to do with that acknowledgement belongs to her. It should have been done 3 years ago. Yes, he said. It should have. No qualification. No institutional defense. The flat acknowledgement of a thing that was true and that he was not going to argue with. The line was quiet. The 43 statements, he said, the people who wrote them before 6 in the morning, they did that because of what they watched you do for 6 weeks, Captain. Not Thursday. The 6 weeks before Thursday, the memos, the endurance trial, the stillness. He paused. That is the record that matters most, not the footage, not the fracture. She held the phone and said nothing. You have your orders, he said. Westfield is waiting. He ended the call. She sat in the West Texas dark for a long time. The base moved through its nighttime rhythms below her quarters, the sounds of an institution that had been running continuously for decades and would continue running after every person currently inside it had come and gone and been replaced. The transfer request was closed. The unknown name had been Holt's machinery, which had always been Holt's machinery reaching forward through time to prevent something that could not be prevented. Because the thing that needed to happen was not about a specific person arriving. It was about a line, and lines she had come to understand find the people who will hold them eventually. The institution does not always deserve credit for that, but occasionally imperfectly against considerable internal resistance, it creates the conditions. She reached into her breast pocket, held the folded paper without opening it. She knew what was inside the way you know the contents of something you have read enough times to carry within you. Then the knock came. Not Briggs's 3 sharp beats, lighter, more deliberate. The knock of someone who has been standing outside a door for a few minutes, working up to the motion. Come in, she said. Private Cade Osmond stood in the doorway. He was in his off-duty clothes, civilian shirt, plain pants, and the absence of the uniform made him look younger than 19, which she had not thought was possible. He was carrying something in his right hand, with the specific care of someone transporting something that cannot be replaced. He came in when she gestured. He did not sit. He stood in the middle of the room with the bearing of someone who has been working toward a moment for a long time and has arrived at it and is now learning what it actually feels like to be here. He held out what he was carrying. It was a piece of notebook paper folded once. She took it and opened it. A pencil drawing. Careful, practiced lines, the kind of drawing that takes longer than it appears to. A soldier in uniform standing straight, facing forward. Behind the soldier in the background, a figure with one arm raised, the posture unmistakable to anyone who had been on that exercise ground. But the soldier in the foreground was not looking at the figure behind her. Not reacting, not bracing, simply standing. At the bottom in small printed letters, strength isn't loud. It just doesn't move. She held the drawing in both hands. She did not look up for a moment. When she did, Osman was watching her with the expression of someone who has more to say and is deciding whether the moment has arrived. She waited. My father was the one who didn't come home, he said. Kandahar, 2019. 3rd Battalion. The room was quiet in a way that rooms rarely are. He met her eyes. He was 19 years old and had been carrying this for 5 years. And he said the sentence without his voice breaking, which she understood was not the absence of feeling, but the presence of a great deal of it held, in the way certain people learn to hold things when the alternative is letting them spill in places where they cannot be gathered back up. His name was Sergeant First Class Darnell Osman. Cade continued, 11 years in, he had 2 prior tours. He paused. He wrote me a letter the night before that operation. He didn't mail it. It was in his effects when they sent his things back. She held his gaze. I enlisted because I needed to know what happened, he said. Not the official version. I know what the official record says. He looked at her steadily. I needed to know what actually happened, and I needed to be somewhere I could ask that question without it disappearing. She said, did you find what you came for? He thought about it with the seriousness of someone who will not give a reflexive answer. Then I found something, he said. I'm not sure it's the same thing I came for. He looked at her. I found out that the man who made the decision that night is no longer in command of anything. And I found out that the reason he isn't, he paused, is because someone else decided not to move. She held his gaze. She reached into her breast pocket, took out the folded paper, held it for a moment with the weight of 3 years and 2 nights in her hands, the 4 names in pen, the one in pencil below them. Then she held it out to him. He looked at it, did not take it immediately. There are names in there, she said, people I served with, people I watched go home in ways they did not plan to. I carried that list because I needed to remember the cost. She paused. Your father's name is not on it. I was not there, and I cannot speak to what I did not see. But I have been in enough fields to know what it costs to go into one and what it costs to be left in one. And I know that what it costs the people left behind is different and harder in some ways because it never has an ending. He was very still. She extended the paper further. He took it. He unfolded it slowly, read the 4 names in pen, then the 5th in pencil, lighter, more recent, his own name written there and not erased. He looked at it for a long time. She did not explain it. She let him see it and arrive at his own understanding. When he looked up, his eyes were different, not broken, not relieved, arrived. The expression of someone who has been traveling toward a place for a long time and is now standing in it and learning what it actually feels like to be here. She met his eyes. Keep it, she said. Not because you need a reminder of the kin, because you need to know that someone counted it. He folded the paper carefully along its creases, placed it in the breast pocket of his civilian shirt. He looked at her. Thank you, ma'am. She nodded once. He left. She sat on the edge of her cot in the room that had been hers for 43 days and looked at the space where he had stood. The drawing was still in her hands. She looked at it, the careful lines, the figure that was not moving. She set it on the small table beside her cot, lay back, looked at the ceiling of a room she would leave in the morning and not return to. Outside, Fort Harlan did what institutions do when something large has moved through them. It continued. Maintenance checks ran, communication watches ran. The invisible infrastructure of a military installation sustained itself through the dark hours, the way it had sustained itself for decades, indifferent to the individual lives that moved through it and were changed by it and left it changed. She looked at the ceiling for a long time. Then she closed her eyes. She was gone from Fort Harlan before 0700. Same government-issue sedan, same single duffel bag. The gate guard checked her credentials with the precise efficiency of training, and she was through the gate and on the flat West Texas road before the sun had finished deciding what kind of day it intended to be. At the edge of the access road where it met the state highway, she stopped. Not because she had to, because some moments deserve to be registered with full attention without hurry before they become the past. 43 days. 43 people who had written their names on pieces of paper before 6 in the morning. A lieutenant whose record had been corrected 3 years too late. 3 captains who had been broken down through channels before her arrival. 1 private who had come to find the shape of something his father had been taken by and who had found something different but perhaps more durable, the knowledge that the cost had been counted by someone standing close enough to feel it. 1 photograph of a young officer laughing in 2004 that had done the work of explaining, without excusing, how a man becomes the worst version of himself when the systems around him decide that his worst version is acceptable. 1 general operating a long patience from a Pentagon office building, a record over years waiting for someone to stand at the center of it when it finally broke open. She thought about the 30 seconds in a hallway on her second day, her hand flat against the wall, the words still landing somewhere they were not supposed to have access to, and the decision she had made when she pushed off that wall. She had not come to Fort Harlan for any of this. It had found her anyway. She thought that is how it goes with the things that matter. They do not wait for invitation. They arrive when the conditions are right, and they find the people who are capable of standing in them, and they ask those people to pay a cost that is rarely distributed fairly and is ever fully compensated. She had paid it, she was paying it still, and would pay it at Westfield and at whatever came after Westfield, because that was the nature of the thing she had decided to be when she first put on the uniform, and there was no version of being that thing which did not involve the cost. She looked down the highway. Flat and straight and long, the way West Texas roads are not easy, not forgiving, but clear. You could see a long way in any direction. You could see exactly what was coming. She pulled onto the highway. Fort Harlan went into the distance behind her, and she did not look at it. The road ahead opened up under the morning sky, white and honest, and without apology. She drove. Colonel Whitfield Holt was administratively separated from the United States Army under a negotiated discharge agreement. No formal charges were filed. The Inspector General report was classified. The specific contents of the parallel documentation file, compiled over 8 months by Major Stellan Thorne, have never been made public. The unnamed lieutenant, whose transfer was coded as voluntary in the official record, received a formal written acknowledgement from the Department of the Army. Her record was amended. She was contacted directly by Colonel Warren's office. She declined further comment to anyone outside that conversation. Private Cade Osmond completed his enlistment. He served 4 more years. He was honorably discharged with a commendation for leadership under adverse conditions. He kept the piece of paper. He carries it in his breast pocket. It has 5 names on it. He never learned the full operational account of what happened the night his father did not come home. Some records the Army keeps, but some it cannot. A general was once asked why good officers stay silent when they witness wrong being done inside the institution they serve. He said because the uniform teaches them that the mission outlasts the man who speaks. Captain Marin Aldrin didn't believe that. 317 soldiers were there when she proved it.